My name is Beth Novak. I'm a professor here at Northeastern and director of the Burns Center for Social Change and the GovLab, and host of the Reboot blog, where we focus on ways we can use AI positively to strengthen democracy and improve governance. We have critical conversations about what this tech means for us, and especially for our institutions. And I'm very excited to welcome our two speakers who have been doing path-breaking research, both the article you hear about and hopefully a broader range of work, because they have been publishing a lot and doing a lot of interesting experiments of late, looking at how AI can help us foster greater civility, more fruitful and productive conversations, and stronger citizen deliberation. And I'm sure we can all agree that in this day and age, more civility is really in short supply. So we're excited to talk with you about the work you've been doing and where we go from here. We will put bios for both of them in the chat. But you both, I will just say briefly, have been longtime research scientists at Deepmind. You are also at MIT now as an assistant professor. And I think I will leave it at that, so we have more time for you to talk. But as we go along, I'm going to put lots of links to their research. I will put full bios in the chat so that everybody has it. So Michiel, welcome.
Thanks so much for the intro. Just to like give everyone the right credit, MH and I led this work, but we, as you see on the slide, we worked with loads of amazing collaborators at Deepmind. Specifically Chris, with who we worked on several papers, Dan, Hannah, Martin, Raphael, basically all the folks on this slide did a lot of the work that we're presenting here today. Also, as Beth already alluded to, we've done more work in this space. I'll specifically talk about one paper which was published in the journal Science last October. But we've also published work at NeurIPS, which was more focused on the technical side of things, and follow-up work that both I did with other people and MH did with other folks. So I'll encourage you to either ask us about it or to look at that work. The goal of this project was to help people find common ground in democratic deliberation. And let me check on the clicker. Oh no, the clicker stopped working. Classic.
Classic.
Let me see what. Oh yeah, it's back. So the goal is to help people find common ground in democratic deliberation. And why we sort of embarked on this journey and this project is because we care about AI, but we also care very much about democracy. And democracy rests upon exchange of ideas, upon conversation, upon deliberation. And this is both the case for sort of, if we think back about Athenian democracy, but also now, right, like conversation and deliberation is maybe more important than ever, but also harder than ever. And group deliberation is very difficult. So it's expensive, it's hard to scale, often mediation helps a lot, but mediation is hard to scale. And the other thing is that it's important that voices are being heard equally. And often, if you think about deliberation online or in person, it's hard to really find mechanisms that support that. And so we have been working on language model systems that provide an opportunity to scale and to support deliberation. And so we ask if AI mediation can help people find common ground. And as sort of a case study or a specific question or a specific sort of setting we look at, we start with small scale deliberation. So between 3 and 5 people, they all see a question. And these are questions that we also generate with language models. And there are questions like, should the government provide universal free childcare from birth? And here you see 4 opinions from participants in the UK. So this is one of the set of participants that took part in our study. And you see also, if you read the opinions and you look at the highlight, that these are all people who want slightly different things, right? They have slightly different opinions, different views, different values they express in their opinions. And the question we ask is, can we come up with some sort of human AI collaborative system that helps these people find common ground? So that takes these opinions and that through a process finds some group statement that maximizes some notion of endorsement among these participants. Right? So how can we build a system like that? So we start with a human experiment. And in this human experiment, we implement something that people call caucus mediation. So there are 5 people that interact with the mediator. The mediator in this case is an AI, and people don't see each other's opinions. So they see a question, like the question we saw on the previous slide, and then they write their opinions all in text privately in response to that question. Those opinions then go into the Habermas machine, which is this language model, this LLM-based system that I was talking about, and out comes this group statement. And the system is named after the German political scientist, political theorist, Jürgen Habermas, who is one of the sort of founding fathers of deliberative democracy. I would really encourage you to look up more about Habermas, and sort of his thought around these questions. And so this system, if we break it down, it consists of different components, and each of these components are built up out of large language models. And large language models is what powers things like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and sort of the systems that I'm sure many of you work with day to day. And here we take a specific language model from Deepmind, which is called Chinchilla. And this model is different in some ways than ChatGPT or Gemini that you work with now. This model is pre-trained on loads of text, but is not fine-tuned yet to sort of follow instructions or answer questions. So we go through a whole sort of pipeline of fine-tuning these models to make them better at this specific task of finding agreement. And what we do specifically is that we train this model to write consensus statement giving a set of opinions that we input via the prompt. And so we have this generative model, and every time there are opinions coming in, it will generate a consensus statement. And this consensus statement, we don't generate one, but we actually generate different candidate statements. So you could see it as if a mediator, instead of generating one sort of group statement, hypothetical group statement, it generates many different hypothetical group statements from that initial set of opinions. And then what we do is that we want to rank those statements, so in this case 32 statements, according to the likely preference of each participant. And remember that initially the participants input their opinion. So what we can do is that we then have another language model, and this other language model looks at an opinion and it looks at a statement, and it predicts how likely someone with an opinion is to agree with that statement. So these are similar models as are used in like training systems like ChatGPT and Gemini, but then they're opinion conditioned. So we don't ask whether a person, a generic person, would prefer this statement or another statement, but we ask whether a person with a specific opinion will like a specific statement. And using this model, we can then rank all the statements that come out of this generative model in order of preference. So for example, for Beth, we know that she would prefer statement 5 over statement 4, over statement 1, over statement 3. And for me, the ranking might be different. And so the model predicts this, and the participants at this stage are sort of not part of that prediction process. But then at the end, when we want to sort of generate the final consensus statement, what we do is that we do this ranking for all participants, and then we aggregate these via a social choice rule. And these are election rules, and they basically help you with aggregating rank preferences. So we then know Beth's rank preferences, we know my rank preferences, we know all our rank preferences in the room, and then we aggregate those to have one ranking of statements across everyone in the room, and we take the top statement as the winning statement. So that's how the system works. We then train it over different rounds to make it better and better, using the ratings and rankings from the participants that take part in the study. So everyone writes an opinion. Those opinions are aggregated into a group statement. We don't do this once, but we do this multiple times. And then we ask people, which statement do you like better? Which statements are high quality, low quality? And from that, we get training data with which, over consecutive rounds, we further improve both the generative and the reward model. So that's the whole setup. So we have a generative model, we have these reward models, and we have this social choice function. And collectively, you can see it as if we sort of run a virtual election, right? Because we know your preferences from your opinion, we kind of know whether you would like some statements or other statements. So we have both the exploration, where we generate many statements, and then we have this sort of ranking that happens behind the scenes. And the interesting thing is that this makes the whole system very interpretable, right? You as a participant could hypothetically go to the full ranking of statements and see whether you agree or not. So then if we go back to this example round of opinions that I showed, we now have this Habermas machine, and the task of the Habermas machine is to take these opinions and to generate a group statement or a consensus statement. And if we then look at an example of a group statement, you see sort of different things which are very typical for the group statements that the system generates. So MH and I both have written tons and tons of these group statements, and sort of the patterns that come back is that for example, here, in general, free childcare is a good thing, but it's important to consider how it's provided for which age groups. And then later it says it should be provided in a way that supports children's development and learning. So it expresses some values that participants express themselves. Then it gives a very clear sort of collective decision or consensus that it says, however, we do not feel that free childcare should be provided from birth, right? So it found sort of one side of the issue that participants agreed on. However, it also gives an alternative that it thinks the participants that are part of this group would agree with. So it says, for this reason, we would support the government providing universal paid parental leave from birth and providing universal free childcare from, let's say, 6 months old. And then at the end, it says it should be available to our parents irrespective of gender. So this is very typical of sort of expressing values, also being very clear and actionable, but then also providing an alternative to sort of make sure that it aligns with the majority, but that also the people who might disagree with the statement get an alternative that they might agree with. All right, we ask a few research questions to better understand and evaluate this system. One is, does AI-mediated deliberation actually help people find common ground? We look at whether AI mediation leaves groups less divided. We look at whether all the viewpoints are represented equally, specifically at majority and minority dynamics. And then finally, we look at some results from a real virtual citizens assembly. The model was evaluated on using a set of 2,500 participants that we recruit online, and most of the data was collected in 2023. So first, does AI-mediated deliberation help people find common ground? And it's interesting as an AI researcher to sort of tackle this question, because often if you tackle questions in AI research, there are established benchmarks, right? We have benchmarks that, for example, do science questions, or in computer vision that tell cats and dogs apart. But here, when we embarked on this, there was no established benchmark, right? So how do we actually evaluate the performance of the system? So what we did is that we compared it to human mediators. So in addition to this Habermas machine, this AI mediators, we also recruit people online that played a role as a human mediator. And these people are both, they get instructions, they get examples of good statements, so we try to train them. And in addition, they are financially incentivized. So they get a bonus from us if participants end up choosing their statement, agreeing with their statement more than with the statement of the Habermas machine. So here we have 440 participants, and the mediator is randomly selected from sort of the same group of online participants. And what we see is that the Habermas machine actually does better than a human mediator. And it does better for a few reasons, which we evaluate with an additional set of participants. It's people say it's more clear, it's more informative, and the perceived fairness, so how it aggregates opinions and how it takes everyone's opinions into account, is higher for the Habermas machine than for human mediators. However, we also see that the difference is relatively small. And I think the takeaway here is not per se that this is a sort of superhuman machine that does this better than people, but that this is actually a technology that scales, right? So human mediation is very hard, and this is a technology that you could have in a chat group with friends, or that could help small groups in any setting deliberating and finding common ground. Additionally, we now have had this step of we have a set of opinions, we put them in the system, and out comes this consensus or this group statement. But originally, we were motivated by sort of more deliberative settings where people interact with the system, where they give feedback. So at this stage, we added an additional step to the process where we also allow participants to critique the group statement. So you can see it as if we have a conversation about where we want to go for dinner tonight. And initially, everyone gives their opinion. Then we decide, oh, we want to go to a Chinese restaurant. And then in the second round, people can critique the group statement. And for example, we can further refine which Chinese restaurant we want to go to, right? So it's like this additional step of critiquing allows us to refine the sort of solution or the group statement. And in evaluating this, we try to account for something which is called an effort justification bias. So if you were just at the end of the process, you would ask people, okay, do you like the statement after critiquing, or do you like the initial statement, right? So you have two rounds, you have an initial consensus statement, people then critique it, and then the model updates it based on the critique. And now if you ask people, do you like the first statement or the second statement, what could happen is that simply because people collectively worked harder on getting at that second refined statement, that they like it for that reason, right? So that the statement is not per se better in any sort of fundamental way, but just because that's the last statement that they saw, they know it should incorporate their critiques, that they like it better for that reason. So what we do is that we don't compare the last statement to the first statement, but we actually sort of generate new statements that omit the critique, so that only take the opinion into account. And we then ask people what they prefer, and they still prefer the statement that incorporates the critiques, right? So what we can conclude for this is that critiquing helps. And here in our experiment, we only went through 2 rounds. But in theory, you could go to many rounds, right? So if a decision is very important, it might make sense to go through many more rounds of critiquing and updating to further and further refine the sort of statement that we as a group come up with or conclude. Then second, we look at whether AI-mediated deliberation leaves groups less divided. And to test this, we actually have a survey at the beginning and at the end of the experiment. And in this survey, we ask what we call a position statement. So if you have a question like, should we lower the voting age? A position statement would be, we should lower the voting age, or we should not lower the voting age. And by asking people whether they agree or disagree with one or the other side of the issue, we can see at the beginning and at the end of the experiment where people stand on the issue, right? So we could ask in this room, and if 80% of the people say, oh, I agree with we should lower the voting age, we know that that's the majority group, right? And then we can go through this process and we can see if that 80%, for example, increases or decreases. So in that way, we can analyze belief change. And we have a measure which we call group agreement, and which basically measures how many people in a group, like this classroom, agree with one or the other side of the issue. So it takes sort of the maximum agreement in a group. So as an example, if 3 people disagree and 2 agree, then the group agreement score is 20%. If the classroom is split 50-50 exactly, then we have sort of the lowest group agreement is 0. If the group is everyone is on one side, no one is on the other side, then it's maximum. And so in this way, we can see whether the group agreement over the course of the experiment goes up. And indeed, if we look at the pre and post group agreement score, we see that by interacting with the Habermas machine as a group, the group agreement goes up, right? So we don't only find a group statement, but we also actually change our beliefs when interacting with the Habermas machine, and our beliefs sort of converge, right? So the largest group that agrees with each other grows relative to sort of the minority group. So we increase agreement within a group. Now, we replicate this over different cohorts. And one thing you could ask is like, do people actually change their beliefs of interacting with the Habermas machine, or is it simply because they're exposed to different opinions, right? Because maybe people come in not knowing much about an issue, and they just see other people's opinions and perspectives, and they update their beliefs for that reason. So a test that we do is that instead of showing people consensus statement from the Habermas machine, we show people each other's opinions, and we then measure belief change. And we see in that experiment that if we only show people each other's opinions and not a Habermas machine generated consensus statement, that they don't update their beliefs, right? So that the group agreement doesn't increase. And we also do a statistical test to confirm that this difference is indeed statistically significant. So as an intermediate summary, we show that language model mediation helps participants online to find common ground. And we also confirm that people actually change their beliefs when interacting with the Habermas machine. So what we then ask is about majority-minority dynamics. So does it take all viewpoints into account equally? And finally, we look at a virtual citizens assembly. So in most rounds, there's some initial disagreement in the group, right? So there are some rounds where everyone agrees, but in most rounds, there's some notion of a majority and a minority, right? Especially in groups of 5, you always, if not everyone agrees, you always have a majority or a minority. And so what we can ask is, how does the Habermas machine treat these different majority and minority groups, right? Does it, for example, only take the majority opinion into account and ignores the minority opinion? That would be a problem, and this is what people call majoritarianism, so tyranny of the majority. And we test this through looking at the embeddings. So the embeddings are basically sort of the internal representation in a language model of a statement. So these are often long vectors of different numbers that represent some statement in an embedding space. And what we can do is that in this embedding space, we can take the negating statement. So if we, again, have a question like, should we lower the voting age? We can take a negating statement, we should not lower the voting age, and an affirming statement, we should lower the voting age. And we can both look at, in this sort of embedding space, so in this language space, where those two statements live. And then we can draw a line from the negating statement to the affirming statement, and we call that the position axis. So that's sort of the axis that goes, or the vector that goes from the negating statement to the affirming statement. And now we can take all the other statements that we have in the deliberation round, so the opinions, the different group statements, the revised statements, the critiques, and we can all project them on the position axis. So we can see where on this axis from not lowering the voting age to lowering the voting age do those opinions and statements live. So we can see how much do they take one opinion into account versus the other opinion into account, or one position versus the other position. And we look, and first of all, we confirm that this position axis and this projection on the position axis actually correlates with what people say that their position rating is, right? So if they agree with that we should lower the voting age, their opinion also actually shows in the embedding state that they agree with lowering the voting age. So that's an important thing to confirm, that we can use this measure and that measures something meaningful. And then we can also see over the course of the process what happens to the different participants, to the different opinions, the statements, and the group statements. And we see that generally the initial group statements provide more of sort of a consensus opinion, so is less extreme on this position axis than, for example, the opinions that participants project, or that the opinions that participants express. So we're already finding common ground in this initial round of generating a group statement. And then after revising the statement, we see that it leads to even a less spread on this position axis, right? So we're really finding common ground among these opinions. However, perhaps more excitingly, we can look at if we then present these consensus statements as a combination of the different opinions, we can see how it takes different opinions into account in this language space. And so we can see how much does it take majority and minority opinions into account. And what you would hope is that if the minority opinions are, for example, 30% of the total opinions in the deliberation round, that it also puts 30% of the weight on these minority opinions, right? Such that it takes everyone's opinion into account fairly and equally. And so we can test this, and we show, so in those first two bars, that in the initial group statement, so before critiquing, it actually weights the minority opinions exactly as you would hope. So it exactly weights them according to their actual distribution. So 30% of the opinions are minority opinions. It also takes those into account for sort of 30% of the final group statement. We also show that after revising it, so after incorporating the critiques, the sort of percentage of weight on the minority opinions actually goes up. And remember that we actually had an increased approval when incorporating these critiques. So while it's increasing the approval, so while people prefer the statement more on average, it also manages to take the minority opinions into account more, right? So it both manages to make the majority happy without alienating the minority. Then finally, and this is the final result, we asked, well, but how would this work with a real virtual citizens assembly, right? Because these are participants that we recruit online, we pay them. So do our results actually replicate to a real virtual citizens assembly of people that are demographically representative, that don't do a lot of these kind of tasks online every day, but that are real voters that care about these issues? And so what we did is that we built a partnership with the Sortition Foundation, and through them we recruited participants who participated in a virtual citizens assembly. 200 people, they answered 9 questions over the course of 3 weeks. These were all people from the UK, and so we chose 9 questions that were relevant to people in the UK. And those 9 questions, we knew from the training and evaluation groups that there would be some division among the groups, right? So those are the most interesting sort of cases to test the Habermas machine. And so these are questions like, should we raise the minimum wage? Should the UK apply to rejoin the European Union? Should the government provide universal free childcare from birth? So all questions where we might find and expect some disagreement. And interestingly, if we then look across different groups, so we had 200 people, they go in different sort of subgroups over all the questions. So for many of the questions, we do the experiment multiple times with every group that is made out of those 200 total participants. So out of 200 participants, you could make 40 groups of 5. And we see, and this is a result that Habermas himself also theorized and argued for, is that you get these convergence shifts, so that on specific issues, you see that people's opinions move in sort of a convergent direction, right? So if we would split this group in 10 different groups, and we all discuss the same issue, then even if those groups don't talk with each other, we likely sort of shift our opinions in similar directions across groups. And that's exactly what we see. So we see on different questions, we see these convergence shifts. So for example, we should be trying to reduce the number of people in prison. Initially, 60% of our cohort agreed with that statement. And at the end, after deliberating, 75% agreed. Or we should be doing more to encourage a greater degree of national pride. Initially, 40% agreed, so a minority. And after deliberating and finding agreement, 57% of the group agreed. So to summarize the last 2 points, the model responds to critiques by appealing to the minority, but without alienating the majority. And finally, in this virtual citizens assembly, we show that also with real people, with real voters, an LLM mediation helps on difficult issues that are relevant to UK voters. There are also some limitations with this group. So while our method scaled to very large groups, we only tested it with groups up to 5 participants. And of course, it's a very minimalist form of deliberation, right? So people don't discuss the topics with each other directly. There is no fact checking. There is no sort of plenaries where people get information on the issues. So we really see this as testing one sort of component where AI can make a difference, but that should be part of a larger system. So the highlight result, and here also some pictures of the key people that were involved in this study, we show that statements from AI mediators are preferred over those of human mediators, that groups become less divided, and we tested it with a UK-based virtual citizens assembly. Additionally, we're doing a lot of follow-up work, as Beth already mentioned. So one is work with the University of Washington and X Community Nodes, where we use similar methods to help crowdsourced fact checkers get to agreement on X. We also have a study with the Alliance for Middle East Peace and Remesh on using similar methods to find common ground among peace builders in the Middle East. And we have work with Polis and the Computational Democracy Project. Please also see the citations in the bottom right. And then MH is working with our colleague Georgie on a really interesting follow-up study where we look more at sort of the implications of this work. Thank you so much.
Huge thanks. Okay, I'm going to try to do the task of moderating in 4 dimensions now. MH has been doing yeoman's work answering a lot of questions that have already come in the chat. So if you have like a factual question, is it on GitHub? Does it work in multiple languages, etc.? Put those in the chat. We have a number of people waiting to ask the stumper questions. And let me get us started here. And I'll try to do this, which is, I wanted to start with the premise of what you're doing around extracting opinions from people. And I understand the appeal of the deliberative poll, and I understand the appeal of the citizens' assembly. But in governance, most decision-making is around getting at ideas and solutions to problems. So I'm curious about sort of how you see, and you could you can answer either one of these. Why the interest in opinions, or whether this ports nicely to then extraction of other kinds of information. If what I really want to do is surface solutions to problems, more in the vein of co-design, co-creation, open innovation, we do a lot of work on working with citizens on solving problems. Does this help me with that?
So I think the focus on opinions is also, this is a scientific study, right? So we have, and the interesting thing is that these opinions live in the text domain, and traditionally social choice and aggregation of preferences was sort of never in the text domain, but in like, we have some set of options and we have resources and we want to allocate resources. And so I think here the interesting thing from a scientific point of view is that we find common ground and sort of we find consensus in a text domain. So that's sort of one of the motivations for using opinions. Then to sort of the second part of the question is like, how can this help me actually in sort of ideation or citizen participation? We now use this system as sort of finding one quote unquote winning statement, right? To use sort of the social choice language. But in addition to sort of finding one winning statement, we could also, for example, say, well, find some diverse solutions, or like find multiple statements that all provide different ways of attacking this problem. Or you could think of setting up the stages in different ways that, for example, the first stage or like multiple first stages are much more about ideation instead of trying to find common ground. And then maybe the last thing to say on that is that, of course, in sort of political decision making, it's not always common ground or agreement that we look for, right? Often disagreement and knowing where the disagreement lies can be at least as helpful as finding sort of some statement that we all agree on, right? So, but agreement is often a prerequisite for collective action. So again, I think this is part of a sort of, or should be part of a more larger, comprehensive, holistic system. And we show one component that we think is very exciting and like could help, with finding common ground. MH?
Oh, go ahead.
I don't know if MH has something to.
No, that was great. I would just add that, part of our design considerations in running this large-scale study was that, like, you grab a random person off the street and you ask them a question. We wanted to ask them questions that they would likely have an opinion on. And so the sort of topic of political opinions, you grab a random person, they're likely to have an opinion on many different political topics. Doing something that's like a little bit more task oriented, where you're trying to like maybe have some constraints, maybe there's a budget, it starts to be like much more context specific. And so, but it's a very, important point. I agree, percent. That is where the real problems, and that's where real problems are. And so, future versions of these ideas, I think, could be applicable there.
So I have 50 things to ask you, but since we have over 100 people online and almost that number in the room, we're going to do this again, we'll try to bring some more voices into this at the same time. So maybe I could ask, we have Kostas Panagopoulos, who's was until recently chair of political science, but more importantly, Decision Desk NBC, who's on the line. And then from Barcelona, I've got Jose Marti from UPF waiting to ask you questions. So let me call on both of them. Josep, why don't we start with you? You've got half of Europe is on the phone here. So a lot of people stayed up late to listen. Let's hear some tough questions here.
Okay, thank you, Beth, and thank you, Michiel and MH. So it's a great paper, and I also had the opportunity to discuss it with MH and Chris in Barcelona. So my worry here is about the deliberative part, and let's say the Habermasian part in the paper. So in the title you say whether AI can help humans finding common ground in democratic deliberation. I think it might help finding this common ground, but not through deliberation. At least in the paper, I don't see enough how deliberation is playing a part here. So finding common ground, existing common ground, or even new common ground that was not evident to the participants through iterative aggregations, it's great. I mean, it might be very helpful for many political purposes, but that doesn't mean that the participants have come to a new agreement based on reasons or arguments that have emerged through the deliberative part, as Habermas would pursue, right? So one worry is about the role that deliberation plays, and the other is about whether these can really scale up, because you, in the experiment, especially in the first part, you have worked with pretty small groups. So what kind of expectations you have for scaling up this process for really large groups. Thank you.
Do you want to do the first part? I do the second part.
Sounds good. Yeah, I mean, we call our setup like minimally deliberative, in that there's some interaction between humans and an AI. There's issuing of opinions and then critiques, and this is done collectively. You know, I think we think of it as minimally deliberative. If you say that's like, no, that's not deliberative, then I would then be curious, you know, what parts of deliberation are kind of, do you think are lost in this setting? And like I can think about what parts of deliberation are lost in fully digitally mediated communication. So like we don't get the you know, oxytocin that comes with touching each other, hanging out. I don't get to see, if it's all text-based, I don't see your facial expressions or intonation, or like, you know, emotion behind what you're saying. So I mean, so like a lot is lost by just doing a text-based form of interaction. At the same time, like we're all in a room together right now somehow. Like I'm 5 time zones away from Boston. So like, you know, we're having a video conference right now, which is incredible that we're having this meeting. I mean, you know, and so like there are digital forms of communication that can actually retain a lot of the magic of like traditional face-to-face, around the table, touching each other kind of interactions. So, you know, I'm excited about like hybrid opportunities, about you know, digital versions of deliberation that where AI can play a role. Though I think there are trade-offs, and like you know, I think it's up to our imagination to think about the, you know, opportunities, the benefits, and you know what gets lost when we make that move.
Jose, maybe one thing to add to MH is participants, we have a post-deliberation survey, and participants also expressed that they learn a lot from this process about the topic, that they learn from the other participants via the Habermas Machine. So people do hear arguments. And of course, there are versions of this that you could do where, for example, initially it maybe summarizes or shows information that it picks from the internet on the topic. So you could add different components, but people do learn from each other. And I think that's one of the fundamental aspects of deliberation. It's just mediated via the Habermas Machine. Maybe on the second point, the scaling. So there's also a very practical reason why we chose groups of 5, because we're doing a scientific study and we want to show that the results that we have are statistically significant, right? So if the unit of measurement is one group, then smaller groups help us to do these experiments better, more efficiently, and with more statistical significance. Now, while for that reason we chose smaller groups, it doesn't mean that we couldn't do this work with larger groups. So generative models now can have context windows of millions of tokens, so millions of words. And so we could include many, like tens or 100,000s of opinions and aggregate those into a single statement. And the reward model side, so where we actually like rank those different statements, already scales to arbitrary sizes of participants. So it might get computationally expensive, but it's very feasible to do this with much larger groups. And of course, the social choice aggregation also scales up to an arbitrary number of participants. So while we didn't test it, we definitely encourage future work that does test systems like this with much larger groups.
So let's bring in Costas's question, and then let's just see, is there hands in the room just to know what's coming next?
Thank you, Beth. This is fascinating work. Really, congratulations. I put a couple of questions in the chat, but let me ask something that's slightly different that occurs to me as well. In your sort of search for common ground in opinions and in deliberation, two things occur to me. One is that we know a fair amount about the nature of opinions and the tendency for people to just not have, very clear-cut opinions or non-attitudes, as Converse called them, or others who have been looking at opinions. And I'm just wondering to what extent, the kinds of responses you're getting or the kind of input that's going into this is largely expressive without much substantive meaning to it, and how much we can really extract from these changes that you are observing in these experiments, given what we already know about the nature of public opinion. My second question is about the nature of common ground as you have tried to tease it out of these calculations, and how that is affected by the polarized nature of political debates in America, for example, at the moment, right? Finding common ground is one thing if you're sort of thinking about bringing people to kind of a similar position, but in polarized settings, I'm not so sure that it would operate like that. So I'm just wondering how you think about it and how this model and this study can help us think about those things as well.
So maybe the second question is the hardest one. So let me start with the first one. But I think the sort of how much content is there really in these opinions? And I think one sort of answer to that is from the results. We saw this plot where we see that we can sort of predict people's vote on whether they agree or disagree with an issue from their opinions, right? So that shows that there's at least some sort of normative content in these opinions about the issue at hand. Now, there are also definitely limitations here where, for example, it's a reward model, it's a predictive model, it's trained on text from English speakers. Me as a non-native English speaker, if I put in an opinion in the system, it might be harder for the model to predict my ranking based on my opinion than if I would be a native English speaker and therefore had maybe a more clearly written opinion. And so it could be that for some participants, the ranking is less accurate than for other participants, and that could create sort of issues of bias where, at least in expectations, some people or some groups of people have less influence in the final decision. I think one of the interesting things here is the critiquing step, where even if that would be the case initially, that I maybe didn't have a clear opinion on an issue or I was unable to express it clearly, that the critique phase allows me to still sort of, given a concrete statement on an issue, to still at least say what I think of this concrete statement. Amage, I don't know if you had...
Yeah, I guess I mean, it's a great question, the kind of notion of what opinions do people actually have coming into this process? And I think some, at least some, maybe a lot of the results are due to people acquiring a viewpoint during the process. This is also something you see in like deliberative polling, is just like basically educative benefits of deliberation on the participants. So just by people exchanging views, people come to learn about the issue. Though I think it's not the only thing that people are. Well, it couldn't be that nobody has an opinion coming into these deliberation results. Otherwise, like there would be like no direction to move in. And the like kind of final set of results with the Virtual Citizens Assembly is particularly intriguing, that you have groups of people moving in a common direction, even though they're sort of having different conversations, different independent groups of people having different conversations, moving in a common direction, which is something you also see in deliberative polling and something theorized by Habermas. So while I do think that there are like definitely educated benefits and like people are becoming more informed on issues going through deliberation, I think that's not the only aspect going on. Regarding the sort of like depolarization, I mean, I think it's worth stepping back a little bit from our specific project and thinking about, well, we think about common ground a lot. And common ground, it's actually an interesting concept that comes from linguistics originally. And it's sort of like the implicit assumptions that we all agree to when we enter into a conversation, because there's a lot that kind of goes unsaid in conversation. And so the sort of set of implicit assumptions that we all agree to are like there for context on the common ground. Now, this concept has been adopted by deliberative democratic theorists as a sort of like way of looking at the outputs of deliberation. And I think it's interesting to note that like the format of common ground is sort of under not fully specified. The sort of statements that the Habermas machine output were these like group opinion statements, like we think universal free child care is a good idea, but maybe not from birth. Like this is what we as a group believe, like as a value statement and like a position piece. But common ground could be also about like things we disagree about. Like we all agree that we can't agree on X, Y, or Z. Like X, Y, and Z, we all agree that we cannot agree on those things. So common ground can also be a vehicle for like clarifying disagreement, which could then be sort of used for further deliberation. Like, okay, last time we realized that we don't agree upon these three things. So now we're going to like, you know, focus in on one of them. And I mean, it's sort of, but like, you know, how far that we can go with this is to be seen. But the sort of like objective function of finding common ground is sort of more general than just a like opinion statement. It can also be different things like clarifying disagreements.
Let's do a quick canvas for questions in the room. I know you have to go, so why don't we fill you in first?
Okay, thank you. Great talk.
John Wibby from journalism.
I wanted to just stay on the issue of polarization for a second, because I mean, for example, Cass Sunstein at Harvard Law School has been saying for like 25 years that drawing on lots of empirical and observational data, that when you get people in groups who have a sort of similar ideological cast, and you have them deliberate, and this is like federal judges, for example, they often tend to end up more extreme in their views on the other end. And so it's this sort of, I don't know the literature that well, but this rule of group polarization has been like a big issue. And so the idea that people are less divided or find common ground sounds in the abstract normatively desirable, but if what happens is their common ground is actually a more extreme position on a hot button issue, I'm not sure that's like a net good. So I'm just wondering how, and forgive if you missed, there's a mechanism to deal with that in here, and I'm sure it has to do with the underlying composition of the groups, but like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. And I think like one sort of empirical result that speaks to the question you're asking is this embedding analysis, right? So there we look at like how extreme opinions are and how extreme the group statements are and how extreme the revised group statements are on this position axis. And we see that the statements get less extreme. So we don't empirically see this. Now, this is, of course, a very different setting than, for example, judges deliberating in a group. And of course, groupthink is an issue. And so it might be because of this sort of caucus mediation setting where people don't interact directly, but there's nothing in the mechanism that we do to sort of enforce this.
Great, thank you.
I think we have, Ani, you wanted to unmute Woody to ask his question, and then we will, and I want to encourage people in the room, if you are waiting in here, also put up your hands so that I know. But you want to go with Woody real quick?
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I guess my question was just that I recently read a column by Annie Duke, and I think she noted some AI tool that has been able to get some people to let go of conspiracy theories. And I think part of the reason it's able to do that is that the AI is not a person who would threaten the conspiracy theorist's sense of identity and get them to like lock in. So I was just curious if, if your tool may have a similar dynamic at play, where just seeing some consensus statement is not as threatening if it comes from an AI than if maybe some other human was trying to tell them, oh, this is the consensus statement.
Michiel, do you want me to?
I could answer it, but if you want, yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's a great reference. Yeah, we're big fans of that work you mentioned, and this we were very much inspired by this potential with our project. So one of the things that we really one feature of our project was this caucus mediation protocol, where the humans don't directly interact, and though there are lots of things that are lost, as prior people have pointed out, some things are gained, and one of the things that's gained is non-judgmentalism. So people can express their opinions however they like, without the fear of others judging them for that opinion. And I certainly have, there have been many circumstances that arise in group settings where there seems to be a loud plurality expressing a viewpoint, where it might be very difficult for someone who's not part of that loud plurality to express a viewpoint. And so, the sort of caucus mediation protocol, facilitated by AI in this case, could be quite useful in those contexts.
I think we have another question in the room. I don't know if it's here, so we'll be surprised.
Go ahead. Or
No, please do.
my question is actually related to the previous one around the polarized nature of certain contested issues. One is, have you tried this for some of those questions to see if really extreme sort of opinions do shift? And the second is around plurality. And given that you have access to sort of this internal representation and the embeddings, and the fact that these large language models can also generate hypothetical perspectives, I wonder if introducing that bigger or broader space of perspectives into the statements or opinions could also lead to more deliberative outcomes.
So on the second, definitely, right? I think you could set this problem up in very different ways than we did, right? So we are sort of generating these group statements that sort of try to maximize the sort of social welfare or social choice among these participants. But you could also have different rounds where you say, what might be something related to this issue that these participants haven't thought about yet, or what would maybe maximize their learning given the opinions. So that's a very interesting idea, and definitely something that is worth exploring, right? Can you help people sort of brainstorm, or can you help people sort of can you bring different perspectives, right? One thing that you could do, also speaking to the Kastenstein work, is if you have a group of people, you could also have an AI that maybe represents the missing perspective in that group of people, right? Which would be an interesting study or experiment to run. Then the first question, I didn't get completely what kind of questions in statement, but maybe you did, Amage.
Well, I mean, I think in the virtual citizens assembly, we had these questions that were actually on previous rounds rated as highly important and were highly divisive. So, for example, Brexit is a classic divisive question in the UK, as is asylum seeking policy, as is the retirement age. So I mean, these are serious questions that people hotly contest, but like I don't think it's the case that many people who have strong opinions about those topics would be likely to shift from the kind of intervention that we did. Our intervention is a very minimal form of deliberation. Each round is like somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes long. That's not a very long time for people to be discussing, very, important divisive issues. And in fact, on the Brexit question, we saw no shift in opinion. Brexit is like completely a calcified question. So, for like the sort of very hard problem of like depolarizing very strong opinions, I don't think our 15-minute intervention is that would have risen to that challenge. I think what the findings we have point to a possibility that there's something here that can be further explored, especially to tackle these really difficult questions.
Also, if you look at this pre and post belief change, while it's a significant change, the change is relatively small, right? It's like if you go from, I don't know, if you start with 4 people on one side and 3 people on the other side, it's not that like every round, generally 1 or 2 or 3 people shift to the other side, right? It's like sub 1 person. So on average, the shift is increases group agreement, but there are many rounds where the group agreement stays the same.
So we have another question. Ani, is Ariel want to unmute? If not, I'm going to go to the room. Let's see. I'll let you pick it because I don't know what people in the room want to ask, so I can't moderate it.
Let's start in the back then. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So this actually also follows up on the same kind of line of inquiry here, but kind of going back to some of the literature about polarization and depolarization with respect to group deliberation. My understanding is that it really depends on some environmental factors in which the deliberation takes place. So I understand that sometimes certain deliberations in kind of isolated groups can become more polarized, but depending on certain ways you set it up and maybe introductory statements that you make as you introduce an argument can have a very significant impact on whether it becomes more or even less polarized. So I guess what I'm wondering is whether, by studying some of that literature, it might be possible to kind of optimize the algorithm used to help depolarize. I definitely understand that there are some issues and opinions that are more calcified than others, which is certainly the case. But I also think that there are many opinions that are malleable, and there are also many ways of, perhaps a gradient of hesitancy with which people are willing to fully share their opinions in that context. So yeah, I guess I was wondering whether you'd considered kind of looking into that literature and maybe like tweaking some of the algorithms a bit based on it.
Yeah, so Amate is writing a really interesting paper, sort of more on the implications. So maybe Amate, you want to share some of that work? Otherwise,
yeah, I guess. There was a question raised earlier about bringing in the idea that if the group finds a common ground, which is sort of a divisive common ground, among a larger population, that is maybe not like a societal benefit. Like if you have a group of extremists, say, and they find common ground, it will be for an extreme position. And our experiments and our like little project, our project here, we didn't put any sort of like guardrails on the language model system. So it had no sort of external notion of like what is a valid perspective or invalid perspective, because with the idea of mirroring democracy, like there's not that much limit on like what's a valid perspective. So But at the same time, you can think about the system design as you nicely point out, and how that could, if your eventual goal is like building coalitions or finding agreement in the broader community, you might imagine that you don't want small groups having discussions in isolation. And I think this is one of the things that AI mediation kind of opens the door to. Like, you could have a small group discussion with maybe 5 people around the table with an AI mediator, and there could be 20 such small groups. And there could be information shared through the AI mediator of what the other groups are talking about. So like no one would have FOMO of like missing out about like what other groups are talking about, because the AI mediator would sort of channel information. I mean, this is highly speculative and like tested. But I think, that's one such design change where you at least have information shared between groups, thus potentially mitigating against like any one group kind of going too much down a rabbit hole.
So I'm going to interrupt just for one moment, because we have violated our hard and fast rule that we end the live stream after 1 hour for the sake of people online. But this discussion is too interesting to stop. So with your indulgence, we're going to keep going a little bit and longer for people in the room. We know you have a hard stop. But for the sake of those who have to leave, our European guests who have to go to bed, I just want to let people know, or their Spanish guests who have to eat dinner, that on March 20th at 5 p.m. we have Ed Bies of Medan, who is coming to talk about how they are using AI to counter disinformation in 53 countries through the tools that they're using. And we'll put a link to that in the chat.